Why you should consider exporting your renders as HDRI. This has to be said right at the beginning. A render has to look good on the monitor. If it doesn't, you did a sloppy job with the lighting. If you save a render and open the image in a graphics application and the histogram shows empty spaces left and right, you should consider working on the lighting and rendering again. An HDRI is, of course, a high dynamic range image. Bryce can use them for image-based lighting and can also export a render as HDRI. But what does high dynamic range actually mean? There are two aspects to it. One is what everyone thinks, the range of the brightness of lights. Obviously, the sun is brighter than a lamp and still brighter than an unlit room with the blinds down. An HDRI image file can accommodate such high difference of light, but the eye cannot, nor can the monitors or a photographic print. That's where toe mapping comes in to remedy that. The other aspect is in how many discrete steps the darkest and the brightest parts of an image can be represented. The graphics card of a computer monitor allows for 256 discrete steps between any primary color, red, green and blue, or combined shades of grey. Of course, that makes 16 million colors, but only 256 brightness steps. An HDRI image file can potentially hold 4,000 million discrete steps between black and white. A Bryce render has potentially 65,000 discrete steps, of which only 256 are displayed. This picture represents the limited capability to display dark and bright parts, and HDRI for IBL has the wider range. This represents a normal image file, and this represents the full range of an HDRI image. Obviously, an ordinary image cannot show very dark parts, nor can it show very bright parts. The dynamic range is limited. Now this picture represents a Bryce render exported as an HDRI. There is not more distance between dark and bright, but the discrete steps are much finer than when just saving the render as a 24-bit or 8-bit per color BMP or TIFF file. This would be the normal saved render with the steps. Of course, there are much more than shown here. And this represents what an HDRI saved image from a render, or a render exported as an HDRI, can represent. Much finer steps. Bryce renders the picture internally with 16-bit per color. The pixel values are represented as floating point values between 0.000 black and 1.000 white. If the render is saved, this is done with 8 bits per color. The pixel values are represented as integer values between 0 black and 255 white. However, a render can be exported in the quality it was rendered, and this has to be done right after the render finished. I know, it's all a bit boring and theoretical and no artwork to enjoy. This simple scene has a fully black sky, sun and moon not visible, no clouds, no atmosphere, no IBL, and sunlight is disabled. Then there is a 2D face with the default grey material applied to it and a quadratic spotlight with diffuse 100, never mind specular, and linear fall-off. I render this file. Please note that I had 48-bit dithering enabled, and just after the render has finished I can export image as HDRI file, 96-bit per pixel, and I also save this same render just normal. So we have an HDRI and a normal BMP image. HDRI Shop helps us to measure the pixel values. HDRI Shop, as most HDRI capable graphics applications do, applies a linear tone mapper to the image, which means that the full dynamic range is squashed between the 0 to 255 range of a graphics card. I load the normally saved render. That was this one. Since it is a low dynamic range image, you have to set the gamma, and 2.20 is correct. I also load the same image without using 48-bit dithering, so we can see what 48-bit dithering is doing. I can move up the f-stops, which are shown down here. This will just brighten or darken the picture. So I move it up with the plus minus key. This is the one with 48-bit dithering. You see the dithering here. If I do the same on this one, you can see that we have gray steps here. So the one with dithering is much better. This is what dithering does. It smooches somehow these steps of gray. It is possible to save a normal BMP as an HDRI file. Save as HDR. I can just save it. Now I load the BMP, which I have transformed to a HDRI. That will be this one. This is the one with the dithering, and I also open the one I have exported as an HDRI. Already here, with the linear tone mapper, we notice that we have much more information on the dark part than we have here. Now watch the colors red, green and blue, which should be the same because it's gray. We have here the maximum of 0.996. This is burned out, and if I move the cursor to the right, you see down there how the values of the pixels decrease. And at this moment there is 0. It is the same as we have on the background. We don't have any more information after this point. If I'm looking at the exported HDRI, I also have here everything burned out at 0.996, and if I move to the right, the pixel values descend much slower, and I still have information at 0.005 at the end of the 2D phase. I do have here also values, and this comes from the dithering. If I move up the f-stops, we notice this pattern in the background, which is the 48 dithering background. This is something which we do actually not need. If I open the same HDRI file with no 48-bit dithering and increase the f-stops, everything stays black. We check the difference between those two files. I calculate the difference. I have the grayscale non-48 HDRI and I have the grayscale BMP to HDRI, and I subtract this one from this one with A minus B. This is all you got in the HDRI exported image. This part never appears in the BMP file. This is what you gain in color and brightness resolution if you save as HDRI instead of BMP. The only common part is the burnout part, which cannot be represented anymore. Just like a photograph, if it is overexposed, it is overexposed, and that's it. Maybe the arguments have convinced you that exporting a render as HDRI is worthwhile, but then do not engage 48-bit dithering. But then, if it is certainly nice to have a lot of information embedded in an image, but what's the use if it cannot be displayed? Tone mapping makes the desired information visible. There are local and global tone mappers. Global ones operate on the whole image, local ones also take isolated parts into account. Global tone mapping is easier to handle. There are around 50 tone mapping operators and none is the best. However, the one Bryce has built in is a very versatile one that gives pleasing results in most cases. You can load a square or a 2:1 aspect ratio image into Bryce IBL, tone map it and export it as a low dynamic range image, HDRI, all from the Skylab. This will be done in this way. Load a HDRI image. This one is latitude, longitude, tone map, and then export the image, I call it TM, as a BMP and spherical because that's the one we've loaded. Save. There are free programs that offer HDRI support. At this time, PictureNow is available for Windows 32-bit and 64-bit. And as they say, Mac support is halfway done, so watch this space if you are on the Mac. Luminance HDRI is available for Windows 32 and 64-bit as well as for the 64-bit Mac. And it is free. FDR Tools Basic is free in this basic version, 32-bit Windows and Mac. The advanced version is also available as 64-bit for Mac and Windows and comes at €39. Another program is PhotoRoom HDR, previous name Artisan HDR. It is also free, though there are watermarks. The professional edition comes at $49.95, probably Canadian dollars. At least it was when I purchased it. It is only available for Windows. And of course, Adobe Photoshop can handle HDRI and has a limited tone mapper since CS2. HDRI Shop has no tone mapping operators, but it accepts the free Bantis toolkits, as PictureNow does as well, and they are free. Let's first have a look at the photographic HDRI with a large range between dark and bright. This HDRI is free and available on my website. Go to Ray Tracing, Resources, HDRI, page 1, and this is the one. I transferred this HDRI to the spherical projection, and in HDRI Shop, as we know, we can measure the pixel values or pixel intensities. We get over 3000 here in this bulb. Watch here. You get over 3000 for the value, and down there in the cave the light are very dark at 0.06 about, so we have a very large dynamic range here. Therefore, this example does not interest us, because a Bryce render exported as HDRI gets only up to 1 as the brightest pixel. Without going into detail at this moment, here is something interesting. Here I have the render, which was saved as BMP and then converted in HDRI Shop to a HDR file. I used the tone mapper here, Botaniac, and what we see here is that we have errors. There is white where there should be black. When I use the same image that was exported as HDRI and use the same function here, I get a correctly toe-mapped picture. This example shows again that converting a BMP into an HDRI format is not the same as exporting a render as HDRI. Since Bryce renders exported as HDRI do not have an excessive brightness range, in fact not more than an LDRI, what they do have are finer brightness steps within the brightness range. Outright toe mapping is actually not very helpful because the range can be displayed directly. What you get by exporting the render as a 96-bit HDRI or 48-bit TIFF is more information between dark and bright for post-production and image optimizing. You can bring out details or emphasize details which would be difficult and fiddly doing in Bryce. We use this render, this is the BMP, and we use the exported HDRI. The HDRI is loaded in PictureNow and we go to toe mapping. We will use exposure, set the gamma to 1. We have here the histogram. We don't want it automatic, we do it ourselves. We set exposure to 0.2 about. Offset we leave at 0. You can see on the histogram that we have it very nicely distributed, and we have the possibility for different output formats, but of course we stay at 8-bit. So that's how it looks after this toe mapping. Same example as before, here in Luminance HDR. We use the previous fatal operator. This is the one and this is the new one. We take the older one. We set alpha to 0, or nearly so, and beta to 0.5, and noise reduction to 0.2, and do a toe map. That's okay because it is smaller. What we get is a completely different lit picture, because here where we have shadows, out of a sudden there are no shadows. Again the same example here in Photoroom Artisan, HDRI toe mapping, and we use here dramatic and go down there to even more dramatic. So we have a very dramatic image. We have here the possibilities to adjust details. We can change the exposition. We can go with the gamma even lower than 1. We can adjust the brightness still more, or the contrast, as we please. We can change the colors. Here we will go down with the saturation. And there are also some extras. We can even use some vignetting if you wish to. These are things how to change a HDRI exported render to one's desire. Whether this is nice or not is another question. This is just the possibilities you have without fiddling too long in Bryce. These 3 examples with the same render were really just to demonstrate the possibilities. If we have an HDRI image, we can multiply the pixel values. This will make the result brighter, but it does not change the dynamic range. These are twice the same renders exported as HDRI. I go to pixels scale and multiply them by 4, and I have a brighter image. I can compensate that with the minus key, so you see there is no change at all, but the pixel values have been multiplied. It is the same as opening the aperture of a camera to let more light hitting the film or sensor. I can toe map this unchanged HDRI, taking the standard. I get a dynamic range of 65,120 to 1. And I do the same with this one. I use the same tone mapper without changing anything. I got also a dynamic range of 65,120 to 1. And the two pictures look the same. Now we can subtract, plug in result 1 and plug in result 2, and what we get is black. So both pictures are actually the same. Just to show you, here we have pixel values around at, well, around 0.6, 0.5, whatever, where you look. If you look at the same place here, you see that we have actually 4 times as high pixel values you are at 3 or 4 even. It is very bright, and here we never exceed 1. Multiplying the pixel values does not change the image. This can be helpful if you create an HDRI for IBL. If you do not have enough brightness, you can boost the brightness by multiplying the pixels, but it does not give you more dynamic range. Another tone mapping experiment. This is the rendered BMP. We tone map the exported HDRI, and the goal is to make the shadows less dark. I've already loaded it in PictureNote, and this time we use as tone mapping adaptive logarithmic. We set the gamma to 1.4, then we adjust the exposition to 0, about, the bias to 0.5, shadow luminance to 1, and contrast to 0.1. And this is what we get. So it is a bit saturated, we might have to change that, but at least the shadows are less pronounced here. We can see even on the dark part of this column. For the last tone mapping example, we are using Photoshop CS5. This is the normal BMP render. Here we opened the same render but exported as an HDRI, and Photoshop has tone mapped it linearly, but it's not exactly what we want. In order to tone map this one, we have to go to image mode from 32 bits per channel to 8 bits per channel, and then we get this HDRI toning. We go to custom and local adaptation. We can first, doing the edge glow, increase the radius to 20 pixels, about 20, and the strength we increase to 3.5, about. We leave the gamma at 1, the exposure we decrease to 0.5, details we put up to 50%, about, shadows -15, and the highlights also -15. The color vibrance we put the same as saturation to +20%. Then we change a little bit of the toning curve. We adapt here the curve, go to input about 42 and the output about 9. This makes it much darker, and then again at about 90% we go down to 65%. So this is our curve. Certainly not very realistic with this right outline, but it may be interesting for an effect. I can increase the strength and the radius, and you can see we can make very interesting patterns in the sky. Whether this is nice or not is the artist's choice. just to show with all the information that is from the render in a HDRI exported image, you can do a lot. Then there is another issue with toe mapping you must consider. I have here a light probe, like the Dix, and I just toe map it. Never mind the dynamic range. And I change this image from light probe to latitude, longitude, so 80. This is not very satisfactory because it is much too bright. If I transform this light probe so latitude, longitude was spherical, and toe mapping now, we get a much better representation, showing that side by side. The reason why this one is so much brighter than this one is because a toe mapping operator analyzes the complete picture in order to decide how the pixel values have to be manipulated. The light probe has about a third of the surface of the image is black, and then the toe mapper thinks it has to brighten up the rest of the things. That's why this toe mapping is much brighter than the toe mapping we made from the transformed probe, which does not have any black but only the image. So these things are also to be considered if you try to toe map your renders. To wrap up what we have discussed in this video, an HDRI used as a light probe for IBL usually has a very wide range between black and white. The range is so wide that it cannot be displayed. Exporting a render as HDRI has a brightness range that can be displayed just like an LDRI, but there are much more brightness steps between black and white, and therefore a lot more information that can be directly displayed. Rendered images exported as HDRI can be better optimized because they contain much more information. They can also be toe mapped to make the result dramatically different if desired. Some of the HDRI capable programs that offer some toe mapping operators are available for the Mac and Windows and are free, though there are others that come at a price. Toe mapping operators analyze the complete picture and determine how the values of the pixels have to be manipulated to give a pleasing result. And if you decide to export your render as HDRI, do switch off 48-bit dithering.